The year is 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first men to walk on the moon. Over 460,000 hippies descend on a farm at the outskirts of Woodstock, New York, for a 3-day festival that is still the most famous rock concert of all time. In the world of television, both the Brady Bunch and Sesame Street make their debuts on American TV, while over in Britain, Monty Python's Flying Circus premieres on the BBC. 3 very different shows, but all of which I have spent many hours watching over the course of my lifetime. Here's my personal top 10 rock albums for the year 1969. And of course, the music you've just heard was how the legendary band Led Zeppelin was first introduced to the world. Good Times, Bad Times, Song 1, Side 1 from their debut album. It's hard to overstate just how different and heavy that sounded in 1969. All of my drummer friends love to talk about John Bonham's playing on that track, particularly the speed of his right foot on the kick drum. There are those sections where he's playing quarter notes on the snare and cowbell and triplets with his foot. Now, of course, in later years, so many rock and metal drummers would use double bass drum kits, but nah, one kick drum was enough for John. You could make a valid case that Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Bonham each created the template for what a rock guitarist, vocalist, and drummer would be up until this day. You've got so many classics on this album. We talked about Good Times, Bad Times. You've got Dazed and Confused, Communication Breakdown. These have become rock standards. But Led Zeppelin was always way more than just a heavy rock band. I mean, the name itself, Led Zeppelin, has this great connotation of something heavy and something light. And that's what they provided on almost all of their albums, this one being no exception. We have tunes like Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. It wasn't an original by the band. It was written by a woman named Anne Bredon. And it had been done by many artists. Joan Baez had a version. But as usual, when Led Zeppelin puts their stamp on a tune, it tends to become the definitive version. It's based around a very common chord progression, A minor, and then a series of descending bass notes. So many songs have been written around that. George Harrison's While My Guitar Gently Weeps comes to mind, almost the same thing. Babe, baby, baby, I'm gonna leave you. I said, baby, you know I'm gonna leave you. I got no time for loving, 'cause my time is all you know. I said it's time for you, for the groove is down below. Come on. As many of you will be aware, the band that we all now know as Chicago was originally called Chicago Transit Authority when they released this eponymous debut album. I actually prefer that name myself, but whatever you call them, this is one hell of a debut album. It produced 3 successful singles and stayed on the Billboard chart for 171 weeks. That was a record for a rock band at the time. Even more impressive, this is a double album. I can't think of a single other rock band that debuted with a double album. This was such an unconventional move that the band had to agree to a royalty cut to get the record company to do it. I think my favorite track is probably Beginnings, written by keyboardist Robert Lamb. Remember, Chicago is one of those bands that has several guys who are great singers and songwriters. I've mentioned this before on my channel, but the late 60s and early 70s were the era of the major seventh chord in pop music, and this tune is a great example. It's just loaded with them. We've got A major 7, D major 7, C major 7, G major 7, and on and on. Major 7s always give that great, mellow, laid-back vibe. When I'm with you, it doesn't matter where we are or what we're doing. I'm with you, that's all that matters. Time passes much too quickly. Lamb was definitely the dominant songwriting force on this album. Besides Beginnings, he contributed Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is?, Questions 67 and 68, and others. As the band's career progressed, other members would definitely start contributing more to the songwriting, most notably bassist and vocalist Peter Cetera, guitarist Terry Kath, and brass player and arranger James Pankow. Another big hit was I'm a Man, written by Steve Winwood and Jimmy Miller, and featuring an incredibly soulful vocal from Terry Kath, who, by the way, also contributed a track called Freeform Guitar. Kath was one of the most underrated guitarists in the history of rock. And finally, I want to mention Chicago's use of brass mixed with rock and roll was very revolutionary for the time and influenced many bands going forward.
Hello, cowgirl in the sand. Is this place at your command? Can I stay here for a while?
Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere is Neil Young's second solo album, and the first to feature the backing band Crazy Horse, a group that he would tap time and time again for recording projects over the course of his long career. The album's title came from Neil's dissatisfaction with the hectic pace of the music business, and the lyrics to that title track absolutely bear that out. I think I'd like to go back home and take it easy. I got to get away from this day-to-day running around. Everybody knows this is nowhere. Neil tells a great story about how 3 of the album's best tunes were all written in one afternoon when Neil was sick in bed with a fever of 103 degrees. He actually credits the mild delirium of the fever for inspiration. The tunes in question are Cinnamon Girl, Down by the River, and Cowgirl in the Sand. Definitely a productive afternoon. I love Cinnamon Girl. It uses what Neil calls D modal tuning. I like to call double drop D. Both the high and the low E strings are tuned down a whole step to D. And that riff, it's just a great little piece of sort of proto-heavy metal. Drop D really lends itself to rock stuff like this.
I
wanna live with a cinnamon girl. I could be happy the rest of my life with my cinnamon girl. Another interesting feature about this tune is the infamous one-note guitar solo. He hammers on a D the whole time, and that's it. Now, normally, I wouldn't advise that, but the thing to remember, when it comes to music, a note in itself doesn't really mean much. What's the backdrop behind it? What's the chord progression? And he's got a nice little chord progression underneath, so I think it actually works. The first chord of the progression is D, and of course the D on top of that. Then we go to an A, so the D becomes a sus4. That adds a little tension into the equation. Now we go to C, and the D note makes it a C add 9, also tension. And now to G, and of course D is the fifth of G. Put it all together. And yeah, I think it works.
Helplessly hoping her harlequin hovers nearby, awaiting a word, gasping at glimpses of...
The debut album from Crosby, Stills, and Nash was a huge hit. It produced 2 hit singles, Graham Nash's Marrakesh Express, and of course Stephen Stills' amazing Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. And it's since been certified 4 times platinum in the US. But more importantly, I think it had a very important impact on the trajectory of rock music going forward. In the late 60s, rock was dominated by loud guitars, The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, and I think Crosby, Stills, and Nash made it clear that rock could also take a mellower tone, a more acoustic, folk-influenced tone, and probably had a lot to do with setting off the whole singer-songwriter movement that was so popular in the early 70s. So let's talk about Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, which was written by Stephen Stills about his imminent breakup with then-girlfriend Judy Collins. It's an open E tuning. Stills loves to use alternate tunings, and it's got one of the most iconic acoustic guitar intros of all time. It's getting to the point where I'm no fun anymore. I am sorry. Another thing I love about this tune, it's one of those compositions that sounds almost like 3 different songs in one. You've got the intro section that we just talked about, and then that middle section where it slows down. Friday evening, great mellow groove. And then, of course, the long coda. Do-do-do-do-do. Very reminiscent of something like Hey Jude, right? The repetitive coda, but it never gets old. And David Crosby turns in 3 of his best tunes on this one. You've got Wooden Ships, co-written by Stills and Paul Kantner from Jefferson Airplane. Long Time Gone, and probably my favorite, Guinevere. Such a great atmospheric track, and a perfect showcase for that beautiful Irish tenor voice of his.
My first and last time with you, and we had some fun. We're walking through the trees, yeah, and I kissed you once. Oh, I want to see you soon.
And that, of course, A New Day Yesterday, opening track from the Stand Up album. And I've always really liked the sound of Ian Anderson's voice on that track. It's a bit different than his normal vocal tone. I talked to my vocal coach wife about this. The best we could come up with, it sounds like maybe he's bringing his larynx down a little bit lower, leaving a bit more open space in the back of his throat. A little more open than his usual sound, but it really makes me wish he had done more of it. Stand Up is Jethro Tull's second album, and the first to feature Martin Barr on guitar. Original guitarist Mick Abrahams departed the band as soon as he got a taste of the new material that Ian Anderson was writing for this record. Abrahams was a blues purist, and anybody who followed Jethro Tull's career from this point on knows that Ian Anderson was all about getting way more than just blues influence into his music. Hard for me to pick a favorite on this album, but if pressed, I think I'd go with Look Into the Sun. Jethro Tull was never known for pretty ballads, but this is definitely one. I love the peaceful feeling this song gives me. By the way, in true Tull fashion, there's some weird time signature stuff going on here. The song is mostly in 6/8, but as it gets into the chorus, it feels to me like it alternates between 5/8 and 7/8. I'm not sure. The guy's really free with his time. Took a sad song of one sweet evening. I smiled and quickly turned away. It's not easy singing sad songs, but still the easiest way, I have to say. But when you look into the sun, see all the things we haven't done. Other personal favorites include Back to the Family, Nothing is Easy, Fat Man, and Beret, which is Tull's arrangement of the famous Johann Sebastian Bach piece, done with a swing feel, so it sounds kind of jazzy. It actually works really well that way. Green River is the second of three, count 'em, three albums that Creedence released in 1969. The first being Bayou Country and the third being Willie and the Poor Boys. All three classic albums. It's hard to imagine how they could pull it off. I guess we have to assume it has something to do with the lifestyle of the group. They hailed from the San Francisco Bay Area, but this was a very different band from the other psychedelic groups that came from that place. In interviews, band leader John Fogerty recounts going to see some of the local bands in the mid-60s and noting that they were often so wasted that they were out of tune, playing horribly, and not even seeming to notice or care. So he describes the members of Creedence making a sort of pact on the floor of the Fillmore Auditorium in SF that they would avoid drugs and alcohol and, quote, get high on the music. And it really seemed to work for them. The title track is my favorite of the album, probably my favorite Creedence song, period. I love that intro, such a classic Fogerty groove. It's also got some great lyrics. I love the picture they paint. Take me back down where cool water flow. Let me remember things I love. Stopping at the log where catfish bite. Walking along the river road at night. Barefoot girls dancing in the moonlight. Without a doubt, the most iconic tune on the album is Bad Moon Risin'. It's one of those songs that juxtaposes sort of a jaunty tune and music with a very dark and foreboding set of lyrics, but it really works. That song has been covered endlessly and used in many movies and TV shows. Probably my favorite use of the tune was in a great little 80s flick called An American Werewolf in London, which balances horror and comedy in much the same way that Bad Moon Rising balances happy music with dark lyrics. Very astute choice. And the B-side of Bad Moon Rising was another great track called Lodi. Anybody that's played in a struggling rock and roll band can relate to the lyrics. If I only had $1 for every song I sung, every time I've had to play while people sat there drunk. Recorded after Let It Be but released before, Abbey Road is really the final album that the Beatles ever made. And maybe most significantly, this is the album where George Harrison really came into his own as a composer. He had spent all those years in the shadows of Lennon and McCartney, but on this record, he turned in two undisputed classics, Something and Here Comes the Sun. Something is second only to Yesterday as the Beatles' most covered song. It was performed regularly by Frank Sinatra, who famously called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. The song is masterfully written. It's in the key of C. The verses and choruses are based mostly on a couple of passing progressions, one in C and one in A minor. And when the chorus ends, we get this recurring motif that leads us back to C. We get the 4-chord F, E flat, that's a borrowed chord. G major is the 5 chord, which of course brings us back to 1. But then heading into the bridge, they set us up like it's going to be the same thing, but instead of the expected C chord, this motif instead resolves up a whole step, and out of nowhere we get an A major, and we're in that key for the next few bars. Boom, there's the A major. A major 7th, F sharp minor slash E, D major, G major, back to A. And after another round of that, this time, the G does lead back to the expected 1-chord C. We're back to our original key. And what can you say about Here Comes the Sun? Just a beautiful piece with an intricate acoustic guitar part capoed way up on the 7th fret. Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. But of course, this is the Beatles, so it's absolutely not all about Harrison. Lennon gives us Come Together, which started out as a fast Chuck Berry-style number, and which Paul helped turn into the swampy, groovy thing that it now is. Lennon also wrote Because, a beautiful track with amazing 3-part harmony by John, Paul, and George. And McCartney was primarily responsible for the medley on side 2, so innovative and creative. And even Ringo came up with Octopus's Garden in the tradition of Yellow Submarine, although he had a ton of help from George on that. There's a great scene in the Get Back documentary that came out a couple years ago in which Ringo shows George his idea, and Harrison immediately jumps in and starts helping him work it out. It was a really cool thing for Beatles fans to be able to see that. That one definitely not for the faint-hearted. That's 21st century schizoid, man. And I don't know what sounds more raspy and distorted, Greg Lake's vocal or Robert Fripp's guitar. Although they both certainly fit the mood of the lyrics. Blood rack, barbed wire, Politician's Funeral Pyre, Innocence Raped with Napalm Fire, 21st Century Schizoid Man. In the Court of the Crimson King is King Crimson's debut album and is quite simply one of the most influential progressive rock albums of all time. In fact, Rolling Stone once placed it at number 2 on their list of most influential prog rock albums, behind only Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And in a testament to the range of this album, Schizoid Man is immediately followed up with I Talk to the Wind, a gentle, beautiful track in the key of E, and makes use of a couple of borrowed chords from the parallel minor key of E minor. Starts on E, C major 7, there's a borrowed chord, G major 7, another borrowed chord, but then we get a little 2-5, F sharp minor, B7, which makes it clear that we're still in E. I love the lyrics too. Said the straight man to the late man, where have you been? I've been here and I've been there and I've been in between. I talk to the wind. The wind does not hear. The wind cannot hear. And probably the proggiest track on the record is Moonchild. I think that one's important in that it outlines where Robert Fripp's guitar playing would go pretty much for the remainder of his career.
Way down inside, woman, you need
Well, what do you know? I opened this video by covering Zeppelin's amazing debut, and here we are a mere 10 months down the road, and here comes Zeppelin II, another landmark album. There's a great documentary film called It Might Get Loud featuring Jimmy Page, The Edge from U2, and Jack White. They just get together, talk about their lives and careers, and jam a little bit. But there's a great scene where Jimmy Page busts out the riff from Whole Lotta Love, which we heard a moment ago. And it's so cool because The Edge and Jack White, both legends in their own right, but as soon as he starts into it, they both kind of get these goofy grins like, oh my God, he's playing it. So simple, but iconic. Another favorite from this album is What Is and What Should Never Be, which starts off as a very slow and sultry sort of red light blues number, and then by the end morphs into a classic Zeppelin rocker with Robert Plant wailing his heart out. It's based around two very jazzy chords. It's a 1-5 progression, A13 to E7. And if I say to you tomorrow, take my hand, child, come with me. It's to a castle I will take you. Well, what's to be, they say, will be. So many great riffs, just one after another. Who can forget Heartbreaker? And what about that solo Back in those days, this was kind of the standard for rock shredding, so to speak. Ramble On is another big favorite. It's got that classic Zeppelin light heavy thing going on again. Brilliant bass line from John Paul Jones and some great Tolkien-inspired lyrics by Robert Plant. This would not be the last time he would draw from Tolkien for inspiration. You've got Moby Dick, John Bonham's trend-setting drum solo. And finally, you've got Bring It On Home, another experiment in Zeppelin's psychedelic blues style.
I'm a flippy peanut monkey. All my friends are junkies. That's not really true.
With Let It Bleed, we are right in the heart of what for me is the classic Stones period. On the previous album, Beggar's Banquet, the group had finally got back to the blues rock that had made their name, and they stayed in that vein for the next several years. After this, we had Sticky Fingers and then Exile on Main Street. This is the final Stones album to feature co-founding guitarist Brian Jones, but he was so overwhelmed with his substance abuse issues that he was really only able to make small contributions on 2 songs. They hired Mick Taylor as the replacement, but most of the record was done by that point, so the bulk of the guitar on this record is played by Keith Richards. It's a really strong set. We've already heard a little bit of Monkey Man. You've got Country Honk, which is basically an acoustic version of Honky Tonk Women, kind of a cool idea. Midnight Rambler, which is a nasty blues rock track. And the 7.5 minute long You Can't Always Get What You Want. That tune is sort of the Stones' answer to Hey Jude. And before we go any further, we have to talk about Gimme Shelter, the album's opening track, arguably the Stones' greatest. It's 3 chords, basically. It's an open E tuning. Keith loves his open tunings, although he prefers open G usually. But somehow they managed to create this incredible, sinister feel. But of course, what really puts this song over the top is that incredible guest vocal by Mary Clayton. They decided they wanted a female voice in the tune. They called her in the middle of the night. She was asleep. She was pregnant. Mick said she showed up with curlers in her hair. They hand her the lyric sheet and she reads, "Rape, murder, it's just a shot away." And she's thinking, I don't know if I want to do this. Thankfully, they convinced her to give it a try. And this is what she gave us. I've pulled up the isolated vocal track.
Rape, murder, it's just a shot away, it's just a shot away. Rape, murder, yeah, it's just a shot away, it's just a shot away. Rape, murder, it's just a shot away, it's just a shot away, yeah.
I love the way you can hear Mick go woo at one point when she belts out a particularly gut-wrenching note. So that's it for 1969, 68 coming soon. And by the way, if you'd like to support the channel financially, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description of this video. Any little amount is much appreciated. Otherwise, just keep watching, enjoying, and commenting, and we'll see you in the next one.